In the darkest days of 1942, when German submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than anyone could count them, when the mathematics of war said America would lose before it could even properly fight, there was a man in California building ships faster than anyone thought possible. He had never built a ship in his life. He had no engineering degree. He had dropped out of school at 13 years old, and he was about to become the most important industrialist in the history of American warfare. His name was Henry John Kaiser. Traditional shipbuilders said he was a fool. The Navy said his methods would never work. And then he built a ship in 4 days flat. This is the story of how a photographer's apprentice from a tiny village in upstate New York became the man who outbuilt an empire, revolutionized an industry that had operated the same way for centuries, and quite possibly saved Western civilization in the process. It is a story of audacity, innovation, and the extraordinary power of refusing to accept that something cannot be done simply because it has never been done before. It is the story of how America won the war at sea. In the spring of 1942, the situation in the Atlantic Ocean was nothing short of catastrophic. German Admiral Karl Dönitz had unleashed his wolf packs against Allied shipping, and the submarines were winning. In the first 6 months after America entered the war, German torpedoes sent nearly 500 Allied merchant ships to the bottom of the ocean. The numbers were devastating. In January alone, U-boats sank over 300,000 tons of shipping. By June, that figure had climbed to over 700,000 tons in a single month. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. If Germany could sink ships faster than America could build them, the war was lost. Britain would starve. The Soviet Union would collapse for lack of supplies. American soldiers and their weapons would never reach the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific. Everything depended on ships, and there simply were not enough of them. Traditional American shipyards were producing vessels at a pace that had not changed meaningfully since the First World War. A single merchant ship took an average of 230 days to build, nearly 8 months from keel to launch. The old line shipbuilders on the East Coast assured the government that they were doing everything possible, that their methods were time-tested and proven, and that the ancient art of shipbuilding simply could not be rushed. They had built ships for the Spanish-American War. They had built ships for the First World War. They knew what they were doing, and they resented any suggestion that outsiders could do it better. At that rate, the yards could never hope to replace what the submarines were destroying. Every ship that slid down the ways was offset by 2 or 3 sent to the bottom by German torpedoes. The arithmetic of war was working, against the Allies with merciless precision. Britain's food reserves were shrinking week by week. The Soviet Union was crying out for tanks, trucks, and ammunition that sat uselessly in American warehouses because there were no ships to carry them. The entire Allied war effort was being strangled by the submarine campaign, and the established shipbuilding industry had no answer. The Navy and the Maritime Commission knew they needed something beyond incremental improvement. They needed a fundamental transformation in how ships were built. They needed someone willing to challenge every assumption the industry held sacred. They needed a miracle. What they got instead was Henry Kaiser. Henry John Kaiser came into the world on May 9, 1882, in the village of Sprout Brook, New York, a speck of farmland in the Mohawk Valley that barely registered on any map. His parents, Franz and Mary, were German immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic seeking better lives in America. Franz worked as a shoemaker, laboring long hours for meager wages. Mary had worked in a cheese factory before becoming a part-time nurse as her family grew. Young Henry was the 4th child and only son, with 3 older sisters who helped raise him. Money was perpetually scarce in the Kaiser household. But Henry's mother instilled in him something that poverty could never diminish. She taught him the value of relentless hard work, of seeing every obstacle as merely a problem waiting to be solved. She made him believe that determination could overcome any disadvantage. These lessons, absorbed at his mother's knee in that small New York village, would one day prove more valuable than any fortune. In 1899, when Henry was just 16 years old, tragedy struck. His mother Mary died at the age of 52. Some accounts suggest she passed away in Henry's arms. The loss devastated the teenager and left a permanent mark on his soul. His father's eyesight was failing, which meant even greater financial pressure fell on young Henry's shoulders. He would later trace his lifelong obsession with health care and worker welfare directly back to this moment, to the memory of watching his mother receive inadequate medical care, to the helplessness of poverty in the face of illness. But grief could not stop Henry Kaiser. Nothing ever would. He had already discovered his extraordinary gift for work. By the age of 13, he had made a decision that would have horrified most parents then or now. He quit school after completing the 8th grade, choosing employment over education. It was not that he lacked intelligence, quite the opposite. Henry simply could not sit still when there was work to be done and money to be earned. He was restless, ambitious, burning with an energy that classrooms could not contain. His first real job came at 13, working as an errand boy at a dry goods store in Utica, New York. The work was humble, but Henry threw himself into it with characteristic intensity. He studied salesmanship through correspondence courses, teaching himself what the formal education system could not provide. He read voraciously, filling the gaps in his schooling through sheer force of will. By the time he was 16, he had moved into photography work, and within a few years, he had risen through various positions to become a traveling salesman. But dry goods could not hold Henry Kaiser's attention for long. He had developed another passion that would shape his early career. At the age of 12, he had acquired his first Kodak camera, a device that opened up an entirely new world of possibility. Photography fascinated him. He began working for photography supply companies, traveling across New York State, selling equipment and learning the trade. By his early 20s, he was convinced that photography would be his life's work. Kaiser scraped together enough money to buy a partnership in a photography studio in Lake Placid, New York. The resort town attracted wealthy tourists during the summer season, and Kaiser worked with manic energy to build his business. He took portraits, he processed film, and he did whatever it took to make the studio profitable. Within a year, he had bought out his partner completely. The sign on his studio read, "Henry J. Kaiser, the man with the smile." But Lake Placid had a problem. The summer season was glorious, but winter brought tourism to a standstill. Kaiser's solution revealed the entrepreneurial genius that would define his later career. He opened a second studio in Daytona Beach, Florida, allowing him to work the winter season in warm weather and the summer season in the mountains. He eventually expanded to multiple locations across Florida. The young photographer was already thinking bigger than anyone around him. Then fate intervened in the form of a beautiful young woman named Bess Fosberg. She walked into Kaiser's Lake Placid studio in 1905 to purchase film, and Henry was instantly captivated. Bess was the daughter of a wealthy Virginia lumberman, a woman of education and refinement who moved in social circles far above a small-town photographer. Henry proposed marriage almost immediately. Bess's father, Edgar, was not impressed. This penniless photographer with no formal education wanted to marry his only daughter. Edgar Fosberg set 3 conditions that he assumed would end the courtship. Kaiser must secure a stable job paying at least $125 per month. He must save at least $1,000, and he must build a proper house for his bride to live in. The lumberman was certain these demands would send the young suitor packing. He had badly underestimated Henry Kaiser. Within months, Henry had sold his photography studios and boarded a westbound train, determined to make his fortune in the rapidly developing American West. He tried Seattle, Portland, and several other cities before settling in Spokane, Washington, which was then a booming railroad hub with unlimited opportunity for an ambitious young man. Kaiser pounded the pavement until his shoes wore thin, being rejected by more than 100 businesses before finally landing a position at McGowan Brothers Hardware. He started as a simple clerk, earning $7 per week. But Henry Kaiser never remained a simple anything for long. He worked 12 to 15-hour days. He memorized every product in the store. He cultivated relationships with customers and suppliers alike. When a fire damaged much of the store's inventory, Kaiser saw opportunity where others saw disaster. He organized workers to clean and polish the damaged goods, restoring them to saleable condition. The initiative caught his employer's attention. Within months, Kaiser had been promoted to store manager, then to wholesale sales director for all of Spokane. His salary soared past the threshold Bess's father had demanded. In the spring of 1907, less than a year after arriving in Spokane, Henry Kaiser boarded an eastbound train with enough money in his pocket and a house being constructed in Washington. He had met every one of Edgar Fosberg's conditions. The couple married in Boston on April 8, 1907. Bess would prove to be more than just Henry's wife. She became his confidant, his advisor on personnel matters, and the stabilizing force behind his whirlwind career. Their partnership would last more than 4 decades. Do you think someone with only an 8th grade education could achieve the same success in business today? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. The hardware business had taught Kaiser something invaluable. His customers included construction companies building the roads and infrastructure of the developing West. He watched them struggle with supply chains and logistics. He noticed their inefficiencies, and he became convinced he could do the job better himself. In 1914, Kaiser took the plunge. He founded the Henry J. Kaiser Company, specializing in road construction. It was one of the first paving companies in the region to make extensive use of heavy construction machinery rather than relying solely on manual labor. While competitors stuck with traditional methods, Kaiser embraced technology that could multiply the output of every worker. But his real innovation was vertical integration. Other contractors bought sand, gravel, and other materials from outside suppliers, paying premium prices and depending on unreliable delivery schedules. Kaiser established his own material supply operations, producing what he needed exactly where and when he needed it. He could underbid competitors by the amount saved on materials without sacrificing his profit margins. It was a simple insight, but it transformed his business. For the next 15 years, Kaiser built roads, bridges, levees, and pipelines across the American West. Each project taught him new lessons about managing large workforces, coordinating complex logistics, and completing jobs ahead of schedule. He constructed dams in California. He built levees along the Mississippi River to protect communities from flooding. He laid hundreds of miles of highway through terrain that other contractors considered impossible. His reputation for getting things done spread throughout the construction industry. When a project seemed too difficult, too remote, or too tightly scheduled, Kaiser's name would inevitably come up. He became known as the man who never missed a deadline, who never backed away from a challenge, who somehow found ways to deliver when everyone else said it could not be done. The Cuba project of 1927 established Kaiser on the international stage. He built over 200 miles of highway and 500 bridges in Camagüey province, working in brutal tropical heat with a largely local workforce. The contract was worth approximately $20 million, larger than anything he had attempted before. It was also more complex, requiring coordination across multiple construction sites spread over hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain. Kaiser completed the project ahead of schedule and under budget, cementing his reputation as a builder without limits. By the late 1920s, Kaiser had accumulated wealth, experience, and connections, but he wanted something bigger. He wanted to build on a scale that would reshape the American landscape. That opportunity came with the most ambitious construction project in American history up to that time. The federal government was planning to dam the Colorado River, creating a massive hydroelectric facility and water reservoir in the desert between Nevada and Arizona. The project that would become Hoover Dam was so enormous that no single construction company in America could bid on it alone. The contract required a $5 million performance bond, an astronomical sum in 1930. The specifications ran to over 100 pages of technical requirements and 76 engineering drawings. The government was essentially asking contractors to attempt something that had never been done before. Kaiser recognized that the job required collaboration on an unprecedented scale. He joined forces with Warren Bechtel and 4 other major construction companies to form a consortium called 6 Companies Incorporated. Kaiser and Bechtel together held 30% of the joint venture, and Kaiser was appointed to handle the crucial role of liaison with the federal government in Washington. It was a position that would teach him how to navigate bureaucracy, cultivate political relationships, and secure government contracts. In March of 1931, 6 companies submitted a bid of just under $49 million, about $5 million lower than the nearest competitor. They won the contract. Work began almost immediately on what would become one of the engineering marvels of the 20th century. The Hoover Dam project was brutal beyond anything the contractors had imagined. Workers labored in temperatures that exceeded 120 degrees in the desert summer. Massive tunnels had to be carved through solid rock to divert the Colorado River before the dam itself could be built. Thousands of men swarmed over the canyon, drilling, blasting, pouring concrete, risking their lives every day on scaffolding suspended hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. The working conditions led to strikes and protests. Workers complained about the heat, the dust, the lack of adequate housing and sanitation. 6 companies had to build an entire city, Boulder City, just to house the workforce and their families. Medical facilities were primitive. Safety standards were minimal by modern measures. Men died from falls, from equipment failures, from heat exhaustion, from carbon monoxide poisoning in the tunnels. The official death toll was recorded as 96 workers, though many historians believe the true number was significantly higher. Despite these horrors, Kaiser and his partners drove the project forward with relentless determination. The contract included substantial bonuses for early completion and penalties for delays. Every week saved was money earned. The crews worked around the clock, 3 shifts of men rotating through the brutal desert conditions. The dam rose foot by foot, layer by layer. Millions of cubic yards of concrete poured into forms that would hold back one of the mightiest rivers in North America. The dam was completed in 1936, more than 2 years ahead of the government's deadline. It was hailed as one of the engineering marvels of the 20th century, a testament to American industrial capability. The project had employed tens of thousands of workers during the depths of the Great Depression, providing desperately needed wages to families across the Southwest. Kaiser emerged from the project transformed. He had learned to coordinate massive workforces, manage complex logistics, and deliver results under seemingly impossible conditions. He had built relationships with government officials at every level, and he had developed an appetite for challenges that others considered impossible. When consortiums formed to build the Bonneville Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River, Kaiser was there, applying the lessons learned in the Nevada desert. But it was at Grand Coulee where Kaiser made a discovery that would prove as important as any of his engineering achievements. The remote construction site in eastern Washington presented a serious problem. Workers and their families, over 6,000 people, needed medical care. But the nearest proper hospital was hours away. The doctors who did practice near the site charged fees that workers could not afford, and their care was often inadequate. Kaiser heard about a young surgeon named Sidney Garfield who had developed an innovative solution to a similar problem at another construction site. Garfield had established a prepaid healthcare system where workers contributed a small amount from each paycheck in exchange for comprehensive medical coverage. It was simple, it was affordable, and it kept workers healthy and productive. Kaiser invited Garfield to Grand Coulee and gave him everything he needed. He renovated a rundown hospital, installed modern equipment, and allowed Garfield to recruit a team of skilled doctors and nurses. The prepaid system expanded to cover workers' families as well. It was preventive medicine before the term became common, keeping people healthy rather than just treating them after they became sick. Henry Kaiser had just planted the seed that would eventually grow into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare organizations in American history. By 1940, Kaiser was a wealthy 58-year-old man. He had built dams, roads, bridges, and pipelines across 3 continents. Most men his age would have been thinking about retirement. Henry Kaiser was thinking about ships. The war in Europe had been raging for over a year. German submarines were devastating British merchant shipping, threatening to starve the island nation into submission. Britain desperately needed cargo vessels to replace its losses, and it was looking to American shipyards for help. But American shipbuilding was a hidebound industry, dominated by established yards that had done things the same way for generations. They built ships the way their fathers and grandfathers had built them, one piece at a time, from the keel up, using techniques that had changed little in 50 years. Kaiser saw an opportunity. He had never built a ship in his life. He knew nothing about naval architecture or marine engineering, but he knew how to build things fast, and he knew that the traditional shipbuilders were far too slow to meet the crisis. When the British government offered contracts to build 60 cargo ships, Kaiser partnered with an established shipyard called Todd and won the order for 30 vessels to be built at a new facility in Richmond, California. The established shipbuilders laughed. This road builder, this dam contractor, this man who had never set foot on a ship's deck thought he could revolutionize their ancient craft. They predicted disaster. They were certain Kaiser would fail spectacularly and expensively. They could not have been more wrong. Kaiser approached shipbuilding the same way Henry Ford had approached automobile manufacturing a generation earlier. Instead of building ships piece by piece on the slipway, he would prefabricate major sections in separate workshops, then assemble them together using cranes. Instead of the traditional riveting that required skilled workers and enormous time, he would use welding, which could be taught to unskilled laborers in a matter of weeks. The concept sounds obvious in retrospect, but it represented a complete revolution in shipbuilding. Traditional yards had never organized production this way because they had never needed to. Kaiser needed to because there was no other way to build ships fast enough to matter. The first Richmond shipyard began construction in December of 1940. By April of 1941, just 4 months later, the keel of the first British ship was being laid. Kaiser recruited workers from his dam projects, men who knew nothing about ships, but everything about working hard under difficult conditions. He brought in engineers who approached every problem as a puzzle to be solved rather than an obstacle to be accepted. The first ships took longer than Kaiser wanted. The initial Liberty ship required 131 days from keel to launch. But with every vessel, the workers learned, the processes improved and the time dropped. Within months, Richmond was producing ships in under 50 days, then under 40 days. Traditional shipyards that had been building vessels the same way for decades watched in disbelief as this outsider shattered every record they had ever set. Then came December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war and transformed Kaiser's operation from an impressive achievement into a national necessity. Suddenly, the country needed every ship that could possibly be built. The Maritime Commission expanded the emergency shipbuilding program massively, and Kaiser was at the center of it. Within months, Kaiser had opened 3 additional shipyards in Richmond, plus facilities in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. His son Edgar, now 33 years old and trained in the family business, was appointed to run the Northwest operations. The Kaiser shipbuilding empire eventually encompassed 7 major yards with 58 separate building ways, employing a combined workforce that would peak at nearly 200,000 workers. The scale was staggering. Before the war, the city of Richmond, California had been a quiet community of about 20,000 people, known mainly for its oil refineries and its ferry connection to San Francisco. By 1943, the population had exploded to over 100,000 as workers flooded in from across the country, transforming the sleepy town into one of the most frenzied industrial centers on the planet. Streets that had been empty farmland just 2 years earlier now teemed with workers heading to and from the yards. Housing sprang up overnight, much of it hastily constructed dormitories and apartments that would not have passed inspection in peacetime. Kaiser did not just hire workers. He housed them, fed them, educated their children, and provided their medical care. He understood that a stable workforce was a productive workforce, and that men and women worried about their families could not focus on building ships. So he built child care centers to look after workers' children during the long shifts. He established schools so that children's education would not suffer. He constructed cafeterias that operated around the clock, serving hot meals to workers coming off shifts at 3 in the morning or heading in at midnight. The shipyards themselves covered miles of waterfront. 27 separate building ways stretched along the Richmond shoreline, each one capable of constructing a complete ship from keel to launch. Massive gantry cranes rolled along tracks, lifting prefabricated sections that weighed hundreds of tons and swinging them into precise positions. Welding torches blazed day and night, their blue-white light visible for miles. The sound never stopped, a constant roar of machinery, the staccato chatter of rivet guns, the deep thrum of generators, the shouts of foremen coordinating the endless dance of men and metal. The shipyards operated around the clock, 3 shifts of workers rotating through continuously. There was no such thing as a holiday. There was no such thing as a slow day. Every hour that a building way sat empty was an hour lost to the enemy, another ship that would not reach the convoys, another delivery of ammunition that would not reach the front. The workers understood the stakes, and they responded with effort that bordered on the superhuman. Kaiser understood something that traditional industrialists often missed. Productivity was not just about machines and methods. It was about people. Happy workers who felt valued would outproduce miserable workers every time. So Kaiser provided amenities that other wartime employers considered frivolous luxuries. Most importantly, he brought in Dr. Sidney Garfield to establish a comprehensive healthcare system for the workforce, expanding the prepaid model that had worked so well at Grand Coulee. Workers paid just 5 cents per day, and in return, they received unlimited medical care for themselves. Do you think modern companies do enough to take care of their workers' well-being? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The workforce that built Kaiser's ships would have been unthinkable in pre-war America. When young white men left for military service by the millions, Kaiser looked for workers wherever he could find them. The traditional labor pool had virtually disappeared overnight. Men who would normally have been working in factories and shipyards were now wearing uniforms and carrying rifles on distant battlefields. Somebody had to build the ships. Kaiser's answer was to hire anyone who was willing to work hard, regardless of who they were or where they came from. He hired women by the tens of thousands, training them as welders, electricians, crane operators, and every other skilled trade that had traditionally been reserved for men. These women, many of whom had never worked outside the home before, learned to handle welding torches that threw sparks at 2,000 degrees. They climbed scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground. They operated cranes that lifted loads weighing dozens of tons. They worked the same grueling shifts as the men, in the same dangerous conditions, and they performed just as well. At the peak of production, women comprised roughly 1/3 of the Richmond workforce, and they performed the same jobs as men for the same pay. The propaganda posters called them Rosie the Riveter, but in Kaiser's welding-focused yards, they were more accurately Wendy the Welder. Whatever they were called, they proved beyond any doubt that gender was no barrier to industrial work. The war emergency shattered assumptions that had limited women's employment for generations. Even more revolutionary for its time, Kaiser actively recruited African American workers from the segregated South. He sent recruiters to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas, offering wages and opportunities that seemed almost unbelievable to black workers trapped in the Jim Crow economy. In the South, black men were limited to the most menial jobs, paid fractions of what white workers earned, denied access to education and advancement, subjected to constant humiliation and the ever-present threat of violence. Kaiser offered them skilled positions at union wages, a chance to learn trades that could support families for generations. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of African Americans boarded westbound trains, leaving behind the oppressive conditions of their home states for the promise of good jobs in California and the Pacific Northwest. They came alone, they came with families, and they came in waves that transformed the demographics of West Coast cities almost overnight. The black population of Portland, Oregon, grew from fewer than 2,000 before the war to over 15,000 by 1946. Similar transformations occurred in Richmond, Oakland, and cities throughout the region. A black man standing on a sidewalk in Jackson, Mississippi, where Southern tradition demanded he step into the gutter if a white person approached, could find himself tapped on the shoulder by a Kaiser recruiter and 2 weeks later be riding in the front of a bus in Richmond, California. This was 10 years before Rosa Parks would refuse to give up her seat in Montgomery. It was 20 years before the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. The social transformation was as remarkable as the industrial achievement. The segregated labor unions resisted bitterly. The International Brotherhood of Boilermakers would not accept black workers as equal members, instead relegating them to auxiliary locals with limited rights and restricted job opportunities. Kaiser pushed back against these restrictions wherever he could, directly hiring workers when union rules became obstacles. The wartime shipyards became unlikely battlegrounds in the long struggle for racial equality in America. The ships themselves were marvels of standardized production. The Liberty ship design was based on an outdated British tramp steamer, modified and simplified for mass manufacturing. The original design dated back to the 19th century, but Kaiser's engineers refined it for rapid production while maintaining seaworthiness. Each vessel, stretched 441 feet long and 56 feet wide, could carry 9,000 tons of cargo in its 5 holds, and could be operated by a crew of 44 merchant mariners, plus a naval armed guard detachment of about 20 men to operate the ship's defensive weapons. The ships were not beautiful, their lines were utilitarian, their appearance boxy and graceless. President Roosevelt himself called them dreadful-looking objects when he inspected one. The press nicknamed them ugly ducklings. Maritime Commissioner Admiral Emory Land, trying to counter the negative publicity, organized a Liberty Fleet Day and gave the first vessels patriotic names like Patrick Henry to emphasize their importance to the war effort. But beauty was not the point. Speed was the point, capacity was the point, survival was the point. These ships were built to do one job, to carry cargo across submarine-infested oceans and win the war of supply. A Liberty ship cost roughly $2 million to build. If it made just one successful voyage, delivering tanks to North Africa or ammunition to Britain or food to the Soviet Union, it was considered worth the investment. Military planners calculated that a Liberty ship had to survive only a single round trip to justify its cost. In fact, the ships proved far more durable than anyone expected. Despite the predictions of traditional shipbuilders that welded construction would fail under the stresses of ocean travel, the vast majority of Liberty ships completed voyage after voyage without incident. Many made dozens of Atlantic crossings through submarine-infested waters. Some served for decades after the war, hauling peacetime cargo across the world's oceans. A handful are still afloat today as museum ships, monuments to the workers who built them more than 80 years ago. As Kaiser's methods proved themselves, he deliberately fostered competition among his various yards to drive productivity even higher. He understood that workers responded to challenges, that records existed to be broken, that the human spirit could accomplish remarkable things when properly motivated. He pitted his son Edgar's Portland operations against Clay Bedford's Richmond yards, encouraging both teams to chase speed records. The rivalry was friendly but intense, and it produced results that astonished the entire shipbuilding industry. In September of 1942, the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation built the Liberty ship Joseph N. Teal in just 10 days from keel laying to launch. The achievement seemed impossible. Ships had never been built so quickly. President Franklin Roosevelt himself secretly attended the christening ceremony, performed by his daughter, Anna Boediger. The president wanted to see firsthand the miracle that was happening in Oregon. Kaiser was asked by reporters if the record-breaking pace could be sustained. He said it could. Then a reporter asked if it could have been done even faster. Kaiser paused, smiled, and said he thought it could. The reporter assumed Kaiser was joking. He was not. On the morning of November 8th, 1942, at precisely 12:01 a.m., workers at the Permanente Metals Corporation Yard No. 2 in Richmond laid the keel of a new Liberty ship designated for the name Robert E. Peary, after the famous Arctic explorer. What followed over the next 4.5 days was the most intensive, precisely coordinated shipbuilding effort ever attempted in human history. The construction had been planned for weeks in advance. Every section of the ship had been prefabricated and staged at locations around the yard. Every team knew exactly what they were responsible for and exactly when they needed to complete their work. Cranes were positioned, supplies were stockpiled, schedules were timed to the minute. The entire yard operated as a single massive machine, each part meshing with every other part in perfect synchronization. Working around the clock in coordinated shifts, crews welded together prefabricated sections that had been prepared in advance. Each section weighed tons. Each had to be positioned with precision measured in fractions of inches. The cranes never stopped moving. The welders never stopped working. As soon as one team completed their task, the next team moved in. Cranes swung massive deck assemblies into place. Electricians pulled miles of wiring through conduits that had been installed just hours earlier. Plumbers connected pipes for fuel, water, steam, and sanitation. Painters followed close behind the welders, applying protective coatings to prevent rust. The rising hull bristled with workers at every level, each team focused on their specific task, the whole operation moving with the precision of a Swiss watch. On Thursday, November 12th, 1942, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the SS Robert E Peary slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. The elapsed time from keel to launch was 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Roughly 250,000 individual parts weighing nearly 14 million pounds had been assembled into a complete ocean-going vessel in less time than most people spent on a vacation. It was a record that has never been matched for a vessel of comparable size, and likely never will be. 3 days later, on November 15th, the ship was delivered for service, fully outfitted and ready for war. The total time from keel laying to operational vessel was 7 days, 14 hours, and 32 minutes. In less than a week, Kaiser's workers had built a complete ocean-going cargo ship capable of carrying thousands of tons of supplies to the battlefronts of the world. The Robert E. Peary was what Kaiser called an incentive ship, a demonstration of what was possible when every element of production was optimized. The normal yards could not sustain such a pace. The average construction time at Kaiser facilities remained around 40 to 50 days per vessel. But even that normal pace was revolutionary. Traditional shipyards were still taking 6 months or more to build comparable ships. The Peary itself went on to serve with distinction. It sailed first to New Caledonia in the Pacific, carrying food and war supplies. Later it transferred to the Atlantic, running the gauntlet of German submarines on convoy routes to Britain. On June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day, the Robert E. Peary delivered men and equipment to Omaha Beach in Normandy. The ship that was built in 4 days helped liberate Europe. By 1943, Kaiser's 7 shipyards were producing a new ship every single day. At their peak, they were launching 3 vessels every 24 hours. The scale of output defied comprehension. The Richmond yards alone produced 747 ships during the war, more than any other shipyard complex in the world before or since. In total, Kaiser's facilities built nearly 1,500 vessels during the war, representing 27% of all ships ordered by the Maritime Commission. His yards produced these ships in 2/3 the time and at 1/4 the cost of the average American shipyard. The methods he pioneered, prefabrication, welding, assembly line organization, became standard practice across the industry and remain fundamental to shipbuilding today. But Kaiser did not stop at cargo ships. When the Navy needed small aircraft carriers that could be produced quickly to support Pacific operations, Kaiser proposed building them using the same techniques he had applied to Liberty ships. Naval traditionalists were horrified. Aircraft carriers were sophisticated warships, not floating barges. They could not possibly be mass-produced like merchant vessels. Kaiser faced opposition from Admiral Ernest King himself, the chief of naval operations. But Kaiser had a powerful ally in President Roosevelt, who had long admired the industrialist's can-do spirit. Roosevelt overruled King. On April 5, 1943, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt christened the first Kaiser-built escort carrier at its launch ceremony in Vancouver, Washington. The ship had been renamed USS Casablanca just 2 days earlier, though the christening program still bore its original name, Alizon Bay. The small carriers, nicknamed baby flat tops, could carry and launch 37 aircraft each. They were not as capable as the Navy's fleet carriers, but they could be produced far more quickly and in far greater numbers. By war's end, Kaiser had delivered 50 of these escort carriers to the Navy. They played crucial roles in protecting convoys in the Atlantic and supporting amphibious operations in the Pacific. The strategic impact of Kaiser's achievement cannot be overstated. In 1942, German submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than all the world's shipyards combined could replace them. The U-boats hunted in coordinated wolf packs, overwhelming convoy escorts and sending ship after ship to the bottom of the Atlantic. Winston Churchill later admitted that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war. If the submarines had won, everything else would have been meaningless. By 1943, the balance had shifted decisively. American production, led by Kaiser and the shipyards that adopted his methods, was outbuilding the U-boat's ability to destroy. For every ship the Germans sank, 3 new ones slid down American ways. The submarine commanders began sending increasingly desperate reports back to Berlin. No matter how many ships they torpedoed, there were always more to take their place. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned, and with it, the fate of the entire war. The ships Kaiser built formed the logistical backbone of the Allied war effort on every front. They carried the American army to North Africa in Operation Torch. They transported tanks and artillery to Sicily and Italy. They delivered the men and supplies that made D-Day possible, an armada of vessels converging on the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944. Without Liberty ships, the invasion of Europe could not have happened. In the Pacific, Kaiser's vessels supported the island-hopping campaign that drove Japan back toward its home islands. They carried Marines from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. They delivered the fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment that kept the Pacific Fleet operating thousands of miles from the nearest American port. They transported the components of the atomic bombs to Tinian Island, the cargo that would end the war. On the Eastern Front, Liberty ships carried Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union through the perilous northern convoy routes to Murmansk and through the Persian corridor. American trucks, American tanks, American aircraft, American food, all delivered by American ships to keep the Red Army fighting against the Nazi war machine. Without the ships Kaiser built, the Soviets might well have collapsed under the weight of the German invasion. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called America's industrial mobilization, depended fundamentally on the ability to move material across oceans. Without ships, the millions of tons of war production pouring from American factories were useless. Without ships, the millions of American soldiers being trained could never reach the battlefields. Henry Kaiser was the master builder of that indispensable link. The vessels he produced in quantities that astonished the world made victory possible. The recognition Kaiser received during the war years was unprecedented for an industrialist. He appeared on the covers of Time and Life magazines. Newspapers called him the Miracle Man and America's #1 industrial hero. Roosevelt seriously considered naming Kaiser as his vice presidential running mate in the 1944 election. When Kaiser established an experimental laboratory to explore new projects in 1943, the public sent him thousands of letters proposing inventions and innovations, viewing him as the man who could make anything happen. Not everyone celebrated Kaiser's success. Traditional industrialists resented his headline-grabbing publicity and suspected he was receiving favorable treatment from Washington due to his relationship with Roosevelt. Established shipbuilders who had spent decades building their reputations watched this outsider dominate their industry. Some accused him of profiteering, of cutting corners, of producing ships that would not last. The welding techniques that made mass production possible did create some problems. A small percentage of Liberty ships experienced cracking in cold water, and a handful actually broke apart at sea. Investigation revealed that certain steel alloys became brittle in frigid temperatures, causing welds to fail catastrophically. Changes in welding procedures and inspection protocols addressed the issue, but the failures gave ammunition to Kaiser's critics. Yet the overwhelming verdict of history is clear. Kaiser's methods worked. His ships won the war. The calculated risk of mass-produced welded construction was vastly preferable to the certain disaster of building too few ships too slowly. Military necessity demanded exactly what Kaiser delivered: enormous numbers of adequate ships, rather than small numbers of perfect ones. When the war ended in August of 1945, the shipyards began shutting down almost immediately. The workforce that had peaked at nearly 200,000 people evaporated within months. Kaiser's son, Edgar, and his management team pivoted to new industries. The elder Kaiser, now 63 years old, showed no sign of slowing down. He converted facilities to produce automobiles, founding Kaiser Fraser and later Kaiser Motors to compete with the big three automakers. He established Kaiser Aluminum and Kaiser Steel to process the metals that his shipyards had consumed in vast quantities. He expanded Kaiser Permanente to serve the general public, not just industrial workers, creating one of the first modern health maintenance organizations. By the time of his death, Kaiser had founded more than 100 separate companies. In 1951, Kaiser's beloved wife Bess died after a lengthy illness. Less than a month later, the 68-year-old industrialist married Alice Chester, the 34-year-old nurse who had cared for Bess in her final days. The quick remarriage caused a minor scandal, but Kaiser had never cared what conventional society thought of him. The marriage lasted happily until his death, 16 years later. Kaiser spent his later years developing real estate projects in Hawaii, where he eventually relocated permanently. He built the Hawaiian Village resort near Honolulu, which he later sold to the Hilton hotel chain. He developed the planned community of Hawaii Kai on Oahu. He remained actively involved in his businesses until the very end, working 12-hour days well into his 80s. On August 24th, 1967, Henry John Kaiser died in Honolulu at the age of 85. He was buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, the city where his shipbuilding empire had been headquartered. He left half his fortune to his wife and the other half to the Kaiser Family Foundation, a charitable organization focused on health care. The legacy Henry Kaiser built has far outlasted the man himself. Kaiser Permanente today serves more than 12 million members across multiple states, operating dozens of hospitals and hundreds of medical offices. It remains one of the largest nonprofit healthcare organizations in the United States, a direct descendant of the prepaid medical program Kaiser established for his dam workers in the 1930s. When Kaiser said that of all the things he had accomplished, he expected only to be remembered for his hospitals, he was more prophetic than he could have known. The healthcare model Kaiser and Dr. Sidney Garfield pioneered has influenced medical practice far beyond their own organization. The concept of prepaid group practice, where patients pay a fixed amount in advance for comprehensive care, has become a cornerstone of American healthcare. Health maintenance organizations across the country trace their philosophical origins to the Desert Hospital, where Garfield first experimented with prepayment, and the Grand Coulee Clinic, where he and Kaiser refined the concept. The emphasis on preventive medicine, on keeping people healthy rather than just treating them when they become sick, was revolutionary in its time and is now considered standard practice. The shipbuilding techniques Kaiser pioneered transformed the entire maritime industry, Every modern shipyard uses prefabrication and welding methods that trace directly back to the Richmond yards of World War II. Before Kaiser, ships were built piece by piece from the keel up, each component fabricated and fitted on the spot. After Kaiser, ships were assembled from large prefabricated sections built in specialized workshops, then lifted into place and joined together. The efficiency gains were enormous and permanent. The concept of assembly line manufacturing applied to large structures has spread far beyond ships to include bridges, buildings, offshore platforms, and countless other construction applications. Modern skyscrapers are built using techniques that would be instantly recognizable to a Kaiser shipyard foreman. Prefabricated sections are manufactured off-site under controlled conditions, transported to the construction location, and assembled into the final structure. The speed and economy advantages that Kaiser demonstrated during the war have become standard practice across the construction industry. The recognition Kaiser sought in life has continued after his death. In 1986, the United States Navy commissioned the USN's Henry J. Kaiser, lead ship of a class of 18 fleet replenishment oilers. It was the first Navy vessel ever named for the industrialist. In 1990, Kaiser was inducted into the Labor Hall of Fame of the United States Department of Labor. In 2009, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger inducted him posthumously into the California Hall of Fame. In 2011, he was honored in Modern Healthcare's Healthcare Hall of Fame. Schools, convention centers, and public facilities across the country bear his name. The Rosie the Riveter, World War II Homefront National Historical Park in Richmond, California, preserves the site where his shipyards once stood, telling the story of the workers who built the ships that won the war. The SS Red Oak Victory, one of the few surviving ships from Kaiser's yards, is moored there as a floating museum. The lessons of Henry Kaiser's life extend far beyond shipbuilding or industry. He demonstrated that expertise in one field can translate to revolutionary innovation in another. He proved that outsider perspective, unburdened by assumptions about how things must be done, can see solutions that insiders cannot imagine. He showed that investing in worker welfare produces dividends that far exceed the costs. Most fundamentally, Kaiser embodied the proposition that there is no limit to what a person can achieve if they refuse to accept that anything is impossible. He had every excuse for a modest life. He was poor. He was uneducated. He entered industries where he had no experience and faced opposition from established experts at every turn. He succeeded anyway, through relentless work, boundless optimism, and absolute refusal to believe that the words "it cannot be done" should ever end a conversation. When traditional shipbuilders said a ship could not be built in less than 6 months, Kaiser built one in 4 days. When skeptics said an 8th-grade dropout could not manage billion-dollar enterprises, Kaiser founded more than 100 companies. When doctors told him workers could not afford decent health care, Kaiser invented a system to prove them wrong. Problems are only opportunities in work clothes. That was one of Kaiser's favorite sayings, and he lived it every day of his life. He saw opportunities where others saw only obstacles. He found solutions where experts found only reasons for failure. He built an industrial empire from nothing through the sheer force of his will and his unshakable belief that anything could be accomplished if you refused to give up. The 8th grade dropout from Sprout Brook, New York, became one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century. The photographer's apprentice, who could not afford college, transformed shipbuilding, healthcare, manufacturing, and real estate development. The man who had never built a ship became the father of modern American shipbuilding, producing the vessels that carried democracy across the oceans and defeated tyranny in 2 theaters of war. They said he did not have the education. They said he did not have the experience. They said it simply could not be done. And then Henry Kaiser did it anyway. Find the problem, find the solution, never stop working until it is done. That was the lesson of Henry Kaiser. That was the lesson of Richmond. That was the lesson of the ships that won the war.